Welcome to the Hague Alien Philosophy Channel and another episode of the Absent Connection Newscast. Today we're going to try something new and discuss the very, very strange times that we are living in. Now, you may have noticed that whereas decades ago in the past, the idea of a Democrat or leftist or liberal anti-T movement seemed almost laughable. The very idea of having major Democrats warn people that there really is such a thing as too much technological progress. There really is such a thing as too much advancement. Maybe we need to slow the process down a little bit before certain people get left behind due to things like, say, automation. I mean, it sounded like a joke to say that that could become a Democrat Party talking point even just a few years ago, but now it's actually happening. Major Democrats like Bernie Sanders are warning, hey, this AI thing really is going too far. It really is in danger of taking too many people's jobs, and therefore we need basically the federal government to formally regulate AI so that it's used only for quote-unquote good purposes, whatever good might be defined as. See, people who advocate for the federal government regulating AI take for granted that it's completely obvious what quote-unquote good purposes mean without realizing that the people who get to determine what is good and bad are always the same people running the federal government who are not at all objective, disinterested, etc. in their evaluations. But set that aside for the moment. If we accept that it's gotten to the point now, for the first time in 2025, that it could actually become a Democrat Party talking point to warn that there really is such a thing as too much automation. There really is a human cost to people losing their jobs, not just once, but forever into the future, that this might lead to social problems. It might turn entire regions of the country into, basically just like the Rust Belt, depopulated regions where there's high crime, high poverty rates, there's a drug crisis, etc., because if people have no jobs, well, then they start to become hopeless and you get a bunch of other social problems. Well, it's interesting that Democrats are now, for the first time, turning automation into a political problem in 2025, despite the fact that this has been an ongoing problem for decades now. In fact, we started seeing automation in some form, not just decades ago, but centuries ago. And there were people who angrily reacted against even very, very basic forms of automation back in 19th century England, because they realized that the machine wasn't exactly a sign that progress must still be happening. It's a sign that they were going to lose their income and be SOL as a result. Well, that's been going on for a very, very long time, but for the first time, we see Democrats actually turn this into a political issue, because the kinds of jobs that are now being lost are jobs which were supposed to be safe from this for political reasons. So it's interesting that the same people who basically told every truck driver in the country just 6 years ago to not resist the inevitable disappearance of their jobs, because Andrew Yang said in 2019 on the Joe Rogan podcast that having a robot drive an 18-wheeler with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of merchandise safely on the most busy interstates in the United States in rush hour traffic without killing anyone is not only possible, it's quote-unquote inevitable. And it's only, by the way, a few years away. Now we're over 6.5 years after he said that it was inevitable and only a few years away, and it still hasn't come on the scale he claimed. But still, the people who are now saying, no, AI has to be regulated by the government to prevent job losses, would have told every truck driver in America to accept that as not only inevitable, but also good for them, because it means progress is still happening. Never mind that the number of jobs that would be lost by that are so high that at the time Andrew Yang recorded that podcast, truck driver was the most common job in 31 out of 50 states. But at any rate, all those jobs lost, I mean, they'd be reabsorbed somewhere, if only by UBI, having the government pay them to not work. Well, it's interesting that in 2025, suddenly the same people who would have had that attitude about other people losing their jobs are the ones who are now protesting formally to get the government to regulate AI so that certain jobs don't disappear. Now, those jobs are obviously administrative jobs. Now, it might seem like basic common sense that you need as many administrators as the U.S. has had, but that's actually a gross historical anomaly. John Michael Greer has noted a long time ago on his Archrood Report blog that, of course, any complex civilization in history needed some administrators, but it was always extremely few. If you think of like pre-modern Japan, pre-modern Egypt, pre-modern Babylon, a medieval king, they had some administrators doing paperwork and things of that nature, keeping track of finances, but it was really small. And in fact, as different as these civilizations might have been, the number of administrative workers that they had was actually pretty comparable. They were very, very different from one another in many other ways, but in that regard, there was actually a lot of continuity, because in the absence of fossil fuels, you can only afford to have so many people doing administrative work rather than more hands-on work, which really needed to be done farming and blacksmithing and pottery and things of that nature. It was only with fossil fuels that it seemed not only that you needed way more administrators than any other time in history, but it got to the point where it seemed like, well, no, that's the only real job. You remember hearing this bullshit in your life? No, the only real job is to be an administrator who actually only creates busy work, pushing paper, forcing other people to pay fees and regulations, and, getting in the way, interfering with other people's work to the point that they cannot do their job. A great example of this is what happened within the university system. The cost of college skyrocketed in recent decades, despite actually having per capita fewer actual professors employed. The job of a professor vanished as the cost exploded to absolutely absurd levels, because what increased in that time was actually just the number of administrators. And the administrators basically did nothing to help you with your education except to create so many interferences with the professor's work that they were no longer able to do their job. Basically, it got to the point where the administrators, determined as experts on education who've never taught a day in their lives, but they're still the real experts, they determined you'll learn best if you learn nothing at all. So instead of selling you an education, they started selling you an experience, which was just a euphemism for spending 5 years getting drunk and learning how to beat your bros at beer pong and cock block them on the way to slipping date rape drugs and unsuspecting freshman girls' drinks. And that's the experience that they're selling you for $200,000. So the administrators reached the point of arguing that no, their job is the only real job, despite the fact that at the end of the day, they didn't really do that much except make everybody else incapable of living their lives. And now that we see a slight reduction in the number of administrators, now that you hear stories over the past year of people desperately putting out their story on TikTok saying, I went from $200,000 a year as an administrator of some kind to unemployed, unable to find another job because there are no more jobs in my field due to AI, to homeless within 8 months. So now that it's administrators losing their jobs to AI, supposedly, now suddenly it's a political issue for Democrats. We have to regulate AI to make sure that truck drivers lose their jobs, factory workers lose their jobs, but the administrators over them do not. Now, another industry in which you had an explosion in costs without any noticeable improvement in quality, in fact, the exact opposite, is healthcare. You may have seen charts in which the number of doctors and nurses per capita has not actually increased that much, despite these huge increases in costs. But the number of administrators has. The number of administrators in healthcare has exploded in recent decades, and so too have your medical bills. Ever heard an estimate for a medical series of treatments at $1 million or more? Well, now you know the reason why. So this is an issue in which Bernie Sanders and other Democrats warning, no, the federal government has to regulate AI, not to make it go away entirely, but to make sure it's only used for good purposes, is something which sounds good on the surface, perhaps, until you realize that this is just a euphemism for them stepping in to make sure that administrators keep their jobs, that the number of administrators the society has remains at an absolutely historically anomalous level, that this is done at a time when fossil fuels are running low, at a time when the U.S. government actually is bankrupt, $39 trillion in debt, or whatever it currently is, and the economy is actually collapsing. But we have to use the federal government to force administrators and people of that nature to keep their jobs, even after the society can no longer support it. And that's why it was warned decades ago, you should never allow Democrats to take over the anti-T movement, because even if they seem to get a sense of the seriousness of the problem, it'll be just like environmentalism. It'll just be like the sea change, which I can't say on here without getting flagged, in which, yes, environmental damage is a real problem. Yes, pollution is a real problem. Yes, dumping a bunch of waste into the atmosphere is a bad idea. But the solution will always be to use the government to coerce more tax dollars to go to administrative experts who don't actually provide any solutions, but still get high-paying jobs with lots of benefits and political power as a result. And if we have the same thing happen to the AI movement, the anti-T movement, it's going to be every bit as trivial.